In the glass heart of the palace, the Dragon Queen lay like a fallen sun. The chamber was vast and cold, its floors polished to a mirror, its columns threaded with living light. Citizens had come from distant belts to witness the ascension. They had come in armor and silk, in plated suits and woven sailcloth. They had come with the expectation that strength would be shown, and that the chosen consort would lift the crystal body and accept a life bound to flame and policy. Instead, they watched silence after silence, as the greatest warriors of many systems failed. Soren moved below the crowd through maintenance tunnels where pipes breathed steam and wires thrummed like tuned strings. He had the easy hands of someone who fixed engines for a living. Grease darkened his palms and he wore a jacket patched at the elbows. The palace needed him that day not for ceremony but for survival. A regulator in the climate ring had tripped and would throw the delicate ascension chamber into imbalance. Soren's orders were simple: repair, test, return to standby. He did not expect eyes to find him when he climbed the ladder into the corridor that overlooked the hall. The first attempt to lift the Dragon Queen came from a champion whose armor bore ancestral sigils. He braced and pushed, his muscles like forged cables, but the crystal would not yield. Applause turned to muttered worry. Challenger after challenger tried and failed. Soren watched with the detached curiosity of a mechanic who loved form and function. He checked his tools, tightened a coupling, wiped his hands on his pants. When the lights flickered and a cold current crossed the marble, he knew the regulators had not fully stabilized. "Get down there," his supervisor said in his ear. The voice was thin with urgency. Soren slid into the service hatch and followed conduits into the backbone of the amphitheater. Steam hissed as panels released. Soren worked with calm speed. He rerouted power through backup nodes and coaxed temperature gradients back to perfect. When the lights above shimmered back into steady bloom, he pushed open a maintenance door and stepped into a world full of waiting. The Emperor's gaze landed on him like a question. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. This human among them had fixed the palace with a touch that seemed too simple for such complex artifice. The final champion rose, a veteran renowned for bearing whole warships on his shoulders. He placed both hands beneath the crystal and strained with a groan. The crystal shivered but did not rise. People shifted uneasily. The Emperor exchanged glances with advisors who had always counted on ritual as much as muscle. Then the crystal cracked along a faint seam. A single petal of light split and slid. Panic edged into the hall. Servitors rushed with tools, but their circuits jammed in the heat of a ceremonial failure. Soren moved across the floor because he could not stand idle. He knelt by the damaged conduit and examined a splice that had been made with haste. The fix was the sort of honest work Soren did at docks and cargo yards. He tightened the splice, ran a diagnostic, and the conduit healed like a calm breath returning to a lung. The hall held its breath. The Emperor lifted his hands for the final trial. Silence was a living thing. A low hum thrummed as the signal ran through the crystals. A chosen contestant stepped forward because ritual demanded a final hope. He bent and wrapped his hands around the Queen's crystalline form with reverence and resolve. The movement was graceful and the strain visible in the set of his jaw. He pushed and held, and then his knees buckled. Exhaustion claimed him. People whispered of curses, of omens, of the loss of fate. Soren had not planned to approach. He had meant only to leave and let the nobles continue their casting of fortune. Yet something in the quiet struck him. The Queen lay inert like a thing waiting rather than sleeping, not a machine and not only a symbol. This crystal was the body of a being shaped by old rites. Soren did what his kind did when machinery and ritual refused to cooperate. He listened. He heard the faint folding of light inside the crystal. He heard the micro-shifts of pressure in the stone floor. He felt a memory like a gentle tug when his palm touched a cooling vent. He thought of small things, how a broken hinge could be eased with oil and patience, how a stiff gate could be unseized by finding the right rhythm. He stepped forward and placed his hands on the Queen. The crown of crystals at the Queen's temple warmed under his touch. The sound the chamber made was small, but it ran like a current up through Soren's arms. It was not strength alone the crystal sought. It wanted steadiness, the kind learned in long nights, keeping engines alive when storms hammered hulls. Soren shifted his weight, steadied his breath, and lifted, not with the violent surge of a warrior, but with the slow rising of someone accustomed to carrying burdens without spectacle. The queen came up as if remembering a body she had delayed. The crowd gasped. The emperor's face moved through shock to a kind of amused wonder. The heroics of strength paled beside the simple and stubborn will of a mechanic who had learned to hold things safe. Soren's muscles burned. His palms were raw. Yet he did not drop her when the weight told stories of history and expectation, and 1,000 eyes. When the queen opened crystalline eyes, they were not reptilian, nor alien, nor human. They reflected light and depth like the sea. She stared at Soren, and in that instant something unspooled between them. Gratitude preceded words. The ceremony did not end with a triumph of arms. It rewrote what it meant to be worthy. The emperor called for silence, and then for new words. The old scripts had not foreseen a human who could lift with the power of care. Soren became an emblem overnight. Nobles whispered that the queen had chosen him not for glory, but for honesty. Enemies of the old order frowned. People in the market, who had never believed in palace tradition, wiped tears and spoke of the humble man who had done what champions could not. Yet the change carried an undercurrent of unease. Some regarded Soren as a novelty to be paraded. Others feared that ritual foundations would crack. Soren himself felt an awkwardness that made his laughter thin. He had fixed a regulator and lifted a queen. That should have been enough. The queen named herself Sylthra when words came. She did not speak like any ambassador he'd known. Her voice was slow and textured like water moving through glass. She asked to know the world from the hands that had steadied her. She asked for simple things first: to see the docks, to hear the engines hum, to watch the markets at dawn. She asked Soren to teach her how to hold small objects without breaking them. He agreed because he could not say no to curiosity wrapped in such fierce vulnerability. That night the palace hummed with new stories. A mechanic had lifted a queen, and a ritual had learned humility. People drunk on wine and old rules muttered of an omen. The young and the poor found a spark. The warrior houses clenched their fists. In the back rooms, the old advisors sharpened arguments about lineage and who should carry power. And beyond the palace, where currents and trade met, ships recorded the change and sent it like a pulse through the lanes of the belt. Soren slept poorly. He dreamed of engines and crystal and hands. When he woke, the palace would not be the same. The ceremony had moved a stone in the mosaic of law and habit, and new tides were beginning to move. He wondered if his hands could hold against the pull of jealousy and the weight of expectation. He did not know how to lead. He only knew how to fix. That, the queen said as she rested her head against his shoulder, might be more dangerous than anyone believed. The palace adjusted to the unusual union. Sylthra sat in council and asked questions that mapped new borders between law and kindness. She listened to stories of floods and treaties and to the small grievances that never reached the emperor's throne. People brought her offers of loyalty and seeds and old relics. They also brought grudges dressed as gifts. The warrior houses watched with guarded stares. Some welcomed the change. Others murmured about traditions and the danger of letting a human shape policy. Soren found himself pulled into unexpected routines. He learned decorum and practiced walking beside Sylthra in public. His sleeves bore oil stains and his hair never lost its salt from the docks. He kept his hands honest by continuing to climb into service shafts and check valves while the palace tried to make him presentable. The citizens loved this. They crowded the sightlines to watch a queen and a mechanic share bread and listen to fishermen's complaints. Mira worked in the archives. She catalogued treaties and kept the memory scrolls that recorded the city's history. She had a quiet laugh that smelled like paper and lemon. When Soren fixed the palace before the ceremony, she had been the one to slip him a clean cloth and a word of thanks. After the ascension, she began to find reasons to visit the docks at dawn. Mira and Soren shared small silences that became conversation. They walked narrow lanes and traded stories about engines and old laws. A soft thing took hold between them, patient as a coil warming into spring. Not everyone was pleased. A syndicate in the outer docks had thrived selling influence to traveling captains, and it feared that a queen who listened to a mechanic might close its ledgers. Certain nobles whispered to emissaries beyond the city's borders that the ascension was an affront to history. They sent agents and false rumors. Someone cut the ropes on a merchant vessel at night. Someone left a note in the archives that said the city would not be its own judge for long. Sylthra's council faced pressure to return to strict ritual. Advisors proposed a test for Soren to prove his worth beyond a single lift. The test was framed as a right of responsibility. Soren would be required to oversee the stabilization of the city's climate ring for an entire season, while also representing the palace in negotiations with neighboring systems. It was a task a seasoned administrator could handle, but Soren felt the pinch of inexperience as much as the weight of trust. A rival rose named Taras, a commander whose family had carried banners for generations. He had tried and failed to carry the queen during the ceremony, and he carried that failure like a stone in his mouth. Taras began to gather allies among the warrior houses and certain merchants who profited from the old order. He argued that power needed lineage and muscle. The crowd that once watched him with admiration now watched the palace with two eyes: curiosity and readiness for conflict. Meanwhile, a different threat moved like a tide underneath the city. There were raids on outlying trade posts and a clever saboteur who disrupted shipments with subtle misalignments. The saboteur did not steal goods but records. Ledgers vanished, logs erased. Without records, markets panicked and trust frayed. The syndicate's profits rose as merchants paid for private guards and secret vaults. The palace archives grew nervous as memory became mercenary. Soren and Mira worked together to counter these losses. She taught him the slow methods of cross-referencing ancient notations, while he showed her how to listen to engines for sneaky misfires. Together they developed simple systems that wrote redundancies into the city's daily life. Workers inscribed memory strokes into the grain of crates and sang trader names into the ropes, so that theft would not erase a person's identity. It was clumsy at first, but it built systems into practice. The people began to hum when they worked, and the rhythm helped bind memory into craft. Taras's pressure built into a public challenge. He accused the palace of inviting chaos and demanded a trial of command. The emperor suggested arbitration, and Sylthra proposed something else. Rather than a duel of arms, she suggested a test of stewardship. Taras would be given a district to manage for a season, and Soren would be appointed steward of another. Both would be measured by the prosperity and security they could ensure. If Taras succeeded, he could press for stricter rights. If Soren's district thrived, the city would have proof that different skills mattered. Soren accepted because he would do anything to keep peace, and because he wanted to prove that the life of a mechanic could become more than a single heroic act. He took a district full of narrow alleys and fishers and craftspeople who trusted him already. Mira joined him as a clerk in his small office, and they began to build. They taught the markets to encode names into woven bands, and they taught children to sing place names, so the city itself would sing its map. Tradespeople grew fond of the measures and business improved. Taras's district saw a different kind of management. He used old methods of command and heavy investment in military escort. At first, his numbers looked safe and strong. Merchants liked the visible shields. Yet the deeper work that bound communities together faltered. People complained they had less say. Stories stopped being shared in public and went underground. The syndicate fed rumor into the emptiness and whispered that Soren's methods were foolish. As the season slid toward its end, a crisis struck both districts. A storm the old maps had not predicted rose from the seabelt and bent piers like reeds. Waves slammed, and the light towers above the harbor threatened to fail. Taras's soldiers were strong and saved many vessels, but lack of local knowledge cost lives. Soren's community had prepared for oddities with redundancies and songs. Their nets were woven to flex. They lost less. When the storm passed, the city read the results and murmured. The emperor's arbitration considered reports and witness accounts. Taras argued that his methods preserved order but demanded deference. The city deliberated, and the voices that had once called for strict ritual softened. When sailors told stories of Soren's teams lifting boats and fixing breakers in the dead of night with laughter and steady hands, the result was not a defeat of one method but a recognition that strength took many forms. Taras retreated from the council but did not vanish. He nursed pride and prepared new plans. The syndicate tightened its web and sought allies beyond the city gates. It planted seeds of dissent among distant trade partners who feared the loss of easy corruption. Meanwhile, Soren and Mira deepened a quiet partnership. They repaired engines together at dawn and argued about cataloging methods at dusk. Their hands often brushed over a page or a wrench, and their voices fell soft. Love was not loud here. It was small and patient, and it seemed the city's wounds as much as any policy. The palace adjusted. Sylthra began to sponsor community councils that mixed artisans with soldiers. The emperor conceded that pageantry should not smother practice. For now, the city breathed. But old money and old power learned that music and memory were becoming public goods. Where that led would test more than engineering skill. It would test what a whole city considered sacred. News travels like scent. When the syndicate reached distant ears, merchants began to whisper of consequences. Emissaries arrived from neighboring powers with gold-laden offers to buy silence or to purchase influence. The syndicate answered with sabotage designed to split alliances. Ships once trusted to carry messages returned empty. A pattern emerged. If you could control the story of an event, you could shape its price. Sylthra grew uneasy. A queen is judged by how well she keeps peace as much as by how she inspires. She called a council that included not only nobles but shipwrights, historians, market leaders, and the Singer Guild. Her aim was simple: to weave defenses into the city's culture so that power could not buy memory. The council proposed a network of mirrored archives and a chorus lock system that required multiple communities to sing a code before a vault opened. The idea was messy but beautiful. It used the social bonds Soren and Mira had nurtured into a safeguard. The council's proposal angered some. The syndicate saw a new barrier to influence. Terrace, still smarting, found new allies among those who profited from secrecy. They conspired to falsify a crisis that would force the Emperor to suspend the chorus locks on grounds of emergency. Misinformation became the new weapon. False reports of border raids and false claims of market collapse were seeded into the channels. Trust buckled under the strain. Soren and Mira worked around the clock to shore up the network. Mira wrote cross-indexes and Soren fashioned low-tech devices that imprinted songs into cargo wood. They trained singers from the outer districts and taught them simple harmonies that could act as keys. Mira discovered a way to thread names into the weave itself, so that a lost ledger could sing its owner back into memory. Their love grew in small tasks: a shared cup of morning tea at the archive, a quiet conversation in the engine room where steam misted around their faces. The conspirators moved faster. A night attack left several boats adrift and some guild leaders captured. The Emperor convened an emergency tribunal. Terra stepped forward with accusations and evidence that looked convincing, until Mira found the records glitching in a place no honest ledger could be wrong. She traced the tampering to a chain of shell companies, secretly funded by merchants in the outer belt. When she exposed the links, the tribunal shifted. The city faced a choice: respond with force and risk tearing its own social fabric, or respond with a different kind of defense. Sylthra chose the latter. She ordered a campaign of openness. Markets were required to publish ledgers publicly. Songs and stories were shared in every square. The chorus locks were activated and taught widely. The idea was to drown lies in enough truth that falsities could not take hold. The syndicate had to scramble for new tactics when its secret leverage was exposed. Terras did not surrender. He led a faction that attempted a coup in the night. The palace alarms rang and guards scrambled. The attempt was clumsy because it relied on old notions of force. The city had become a web of living practices, and the people resisted in ways swords could not hush. Fishermen cut lines under marching banners, and singers rose in windows to drown out orders. The coup failed, not because of a single hero, but because ordinary people refused to be coerced. In the ruin of the attempt, Terras fled. His supporters were prosecuted, and many were offered paths to restitution if they would work to rebuild what they had tried to destroy. The syndicate was dismantled. Its leaders faced the awkward task of becoming honest traders again. They grumbled, but business began to flow differently. Without the market of secrecy, corruption lost its profit. Soren did not become a political leader. He returned to engines and to fixing small things. Yet the city had shifted because hands like his had been shown to matter. Mira and he married quietly beneath the lantern nets. Their ceremony was not regal. It was a neighborhood celebration where children braided cords and sailors sang. Sylthra attended and placed a simple circlet upon Mira's head that had once been used to bind the royal scrolls. Together they built a library where songs and ledgers lived side by side. The chorus locks kept memory safe and made opening an event that required many voices. People traveled to learn the harmonies because opening a vault became a ceremony of trust. The city rebuilt its networks of trade and added redundancy into its architecture. When storms came, the nets held. When pirates prowled, they found less prey. The empire beyond the belt watched and learned. Some tried to emulate the chorus locks. Others attempted to copy the laws half-heartedly and found them hollow without practice. Sylthra became known as a queen who listened, and Soren as the oddly steady human who taught a palace to care. Yet danger never vanished entirely. New threats circled the mapped edges, and the city kept its eyes open. In quiet moments, Soren walked the docks with Mira at his side. They watched ships wheel into port and heard voices recite names in the wind. Children played among crates that hummed with memory. The palace lights reflected in the water like a promise. The dragon queen, whose crystal eyes once closed against the weight of ritual, now watched with something like pride as a city learned new gravity. People spoke of the night when a broken human lifted a queen and changed how they measured worth. Legends began to grow, but the true lesson was simple. Care, steady hands, and shared songs could be stronger than a single arm raised in triumph. If you want, I can convert these parts into a YouTube-ready narration with timestamps, produce shorter timestamps for each segment, write voiceover lines, or generate SEO titles and tags for this specific story. Which would you like next?